Touch ID is a pretty important feature that is not really confirmed for this year's iPhones. The reason I say it's important is because I feel like every other rumored feature to come to the iPhone lineup this year is very tech community based, like 120 hertz or slightly better telephoto or slightly better ultra wide. All these things that average consumers are not really going to care about. And Apple's going to want some type of flagship feature that they can advertise to everybody that's not just 5G better now. And how they implement Touch ID, I think, could end up being pretty important. Let's begin. So an idea I actually saw floating around during one of our most recent Twitch streams. Feel free to check me out over there. We do live streaming and I try to engage with most of you best I can. But someone was throwing around the idea of Touch ID essentially being a pro feature, which at first glance, probably like many of you, I was like, no. If Apple wants to bring back Touch ID, they're going to make it a standard thing. Why would they just make it a high-end feature just for the pros? No, that's something that they would bring back for the whole lineup, right? So that they could brag about it of all the new iPhone 13s or 12Ss now have Touch ID again and Face ID, so you can choose whichever one you prefer. But then I started thinking about all the different times Apple has introduced biometrics or used them to differentiate different products, and I realized it's actually pretty common within the lineup. I mean, first of all, let's talk about the first biometric ever introduced in the iPhone 5S, which had Touch ID. That was unveiled at the exact same event as the iPhone 5C. So both of them had iPhone 5 branding, but the 5C did not have Touch ID and the 5S did, which was more expensive. That was the premium option, and they considered having that extra level of security and that extra biometric a more premium feature. Then flash forward to Apple's next generation biometric Face ID in 2017. iPhone 10 got Face ID, but it was unveiled alongside the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus. Both had Touch ID, no Face ID. Okay, I could give a little bit on that one just for the sake of, okay, they gave the iPhone 10 different branding, so that's kind of its own separate category from the iPhone 8. Still, at the same time though, I will say they unveiled 3 iPhones that day, and they didn't all have the same biometrics, so the idea of Touch ID being a pro feature kind of makes sense. And if we look at the iPad lineup in its current state, this is, I think, a more direct example of how Apple is considering Face ID a pro feature for the iPad Pros, but if you want to save money and go with an iPad Air, then you have to settle with basic Touch ID on the side button. So I think it's actually pretty safe to say that Apple will oftentimes look at biometrics as a selling point or as a premium feature, because I'm well aware there's plenty of Android phones that have Touch ID built into the display now, or fingerprint readers. I forgot. You tick off a whole bunch of people if you call Touch ID on Android phones. So, oh my goodness, please forgive me or dislike and unsubscribe. I don't really care. But given how Apple likes to be overly secure and they like to be very, very careful with their biometrics, I'm imagining Apple doing some kind of fairly expensive process to put Touch ID underneath the display, or doing something a bit more complicated than the average Android phone that's going to make it work fast, reliably, and not have to light up the display to visually see the fingerprint. And now, seeing how the best-selling phones in the world, in January at least, were pretty popular with the Pro lineup. In fact, iPhone 12 was just barely coming ahead of the 12 Pro Max. Maybe Apple is going to be a tad more comfortable giving the Pro iPhones a bunch of great selling points. We already know 120 hertz ProMotion display is likely, probably some camera improvements as well. So imagine if just the 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max this year end up getting 120 hertz refresh rate and Touch ID underneath the display, whereas the regular iPhone 13 and iPhone 13 mini, they don't get 120 hertz or Touch ID. That would once again incentivize a lot of people to go for the Pro line, as they already are currently, and I don't really know why. The Pros don't have too many great selling points over the regular 12s this year, and yet they're selling pretty great. So Apple, I think at the end of the day, would much rather you spend $1,000 or $1,200 on your iPhone than $800. So if they're now seeing people are comfortable exceeding $1,000 on their smartphone purchase, then they're probably going to want to incentivize the Pro iPhones to be substantially better. To be fair, the Touch ID underneath the display thing is definitely not a confirmed point, and there's lots of evidence to suggest Apple has not even hit mainstream mass production yet, which means Apple might not even know what this year's iPhone have in store yet. But I also think we should consider the possibility of Apple incorporating Touch ID in the power button, because they've shown they're willing to do that on the iPad Air, and it would probably not complicate too much in manufacturing to just add it to the side button on the iPhones. Who knows, maybe Apple would put it underneath the display for the Pro iPhones because in manufacturing that costs more, but then put it on the side button for the cheaper iPhones because at least with the iPad Air 4, it seems to be not too complicated to add Touch ID to the side and in fact put that on a cheaper device entirely. So maybe that could be the happy middle ground of how all iPhones get Touch ID this year, but the Pro iPhones just get a slightly better, more integrated version of Touch ID, would somewhat make sense given that entry-level iPhones use aluminum, which is the same material as the Air 4, whereas the Pro iPhones are known for using stainless steel, and maybe incorporating Touch ID into a stainless steel chassis is a bit more complicated. I don't know. I'm just a guy sitting talking to a camera in his room, so don't ask me how the technical aspects of everything works, but the more I've thought about this, the more sense it's begun to make to me, because as much effort as Apple might put into the mini iPhone or the regular iPhone, just so that they can say, you know, the iPhone 13 lineup starts at $700, at the end of the day, they will be very, very happy if the Pro Max version of the iPhone ends up being the best seller, because that one most likely has the highest profit margins, and if they can get you spending more money on hardware, they win at the end of the day. So overall, even if Touch ID doesn't happen at all, and Apple is just staying consistent with Face ID across the entire lineup, sounds like the regular iPhone 13 and 13 mini are going to be very, very difficult sells, because we're pretty confident they're not getting 120 hertz this year, and you can't really give them more camera sensors because that's going to be reserved as a Pro feature, which means the biggest differences are going to be a 15 chip, maybe slightly better battery life. So my hope this year is that Apple can actually focus on reducing the pricing for those entry-level iPhones. Yeah, kind of widening the gap between the Pro models and the entry-level models, but still, my opinion, a lot of people were complaining about the iPhone 12 and 12 mini just being a tad too expensive, especially when you didn't buy them through certain carriers. They ended up costing $30 more if you bought them unlocked. I hate that. I hate it when companies do that, and I wish they could go back to the prices where everything is the same, unlocked or on contract, and hopefully they could get the prices down a little bit more. I mean, I think the mini could sell a lot better if it ended up actually hitting that $650 price point instead of $700, and maybe if they got the iPhone 13 regular version down to $750 instead of $800, that might make it a lot more tempting to people, because giving them 64 gigs of storage and only $170 away from the Pro series with 128 gigs of storage and all the benefits of getting a Pro iPhone probably is what leaned a lot of people towards going with the Pros. At the end of the day, Apple might be okay with that though. So I'm not saying expect price drops this year, but I most certainly think Apple needs some type of average everyday consumer flagship feature that people would be interested upgrading with, and I don't think just saying 120 hertz and slightly better battery life is going to be a huge reason to upgrade. This is most likely looking like an S year, and we're seeing amazing sales for the iPhone 12 series, but in today's day and age, people are holding on to iPhones longer than ever, which means if we're getting a bunch of people upgrading this year, then next year we're likely not going to see a bunch of people upgrading. Touch ID, I think, would be a great one, especially in the age of masks, although that might be going away more depending on how the rollout of vaccinations go, but either way, bringing back Touch ID, I don't think many people would be upset about, because you don't have to use it necessarily, but maybe some of you who want extra levels of security should be excited, because there was a report from McGuire Wood, who has untested track record, but essentially there's going to be an iPhone model this year that will support both Touch ID and Face ID, so you can have dual authentication on one device. In my opinion, probably a tad overkill, but if some of you out there want an extra level of security, it sounds like you might end up getting that, but don't count on it. Let me know what you guys would use if you had the option between Face ID and Touch ID. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you guys in the next one.